Mayor can maintain our computer. Looks like a big Mayor can
Right,
maintain
well,
it. Oh, it's on.
okay, get started. Welcome everybody to the Climate Change Subcommittee meeting today. We have apologies, I think, from Nicole, who's suddenly been called away on urgent business, and Eric, who has long
Leave.
service leave, some other kind of leave.
Yep. some kind of leave.
Leave of absence. But I haven't heard from him, so I can't put an apology in him. So would somebody like to move those two apologies, please?
Yep.
Seconder. Peter, thank you. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay. Any declarations of interest today? We have public forum. So we go on to the minutes of the last meeting held on the 18th of October last year. Who was there? Most of us who are here were there. So we'd like to move. That's a true and correct record. Thank you. And Peter seconded. Thank you very much. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Carried. Right. And no questions. I'm aware of any questions. Any reports from anybody? Okay. So we're going to item 9. Is that right? I think that's right. Item 9, the revised Regional Climate Change Strategy Report. So I have asked Anka and Phil, as volunteered as well, to go into this in some detail. I know that you will have read it, but the strategy itself is quite a weighty document and has gone through quite a long and very thorough process, including submissions from the public to get to the state where it is now. And we are wanting, or the Regional Climate Change Committee is, oh, Nicole, your stuff's all over there.
Okay.
The Regional Climate Change Committee is now wanting each of the 4 councils in Southland to adopt this strategy. And so this hopefully will be a recommendation to the Strategy and Policy Committee that we do that. And there's 3 recommendations there. So maybe Anka and Phil, you could go through it and make sure that everything in there, that we understand everything.
Sure, Councillor Roque, and Chair. Michaela, if you just skip to the next slide. The first slides that we put together are really just a brief recap of the extensive journey that we've had to get to this point. So the fact that the Regional Climate Change Working Group was set up in early 2023, and that it's a collaborative working group with Te Ao Marama in partnership, and our other key partner agencies being Gore District Council, Invercargill City Council and Southland District Council. It quickly established that there are 2 key phases to this work, and that the first phase is to work through the development of a regional climate change strategy, and that the second phase would be the fact that once we've landed on that strategy, the second phase is developing a regional framework for action. So the document that we're working through today is that first phase. Okay. So the proposed version of the strategy, you'll be relatively familiar with it. It was notified in terms of a formal consultation process was kicked off on 29th of February earlier this year. So that was in line with the Invercargill City Council LTP process, because basically the deadline associated with wanting to have the strategy sorted was ahead of the LTP processes for all agencies. that went a little bit askew in the sense that there were some changes with some other agency timeframes around LTPs, but ICC's process remained on track, and so we opened the consultation process on the 29th of February and we closed it on the 8th of May. And as part of that, we had it there was an engagement portal on the Environment Southland website, and then people could also write in or email in as well. Essentially, we got 60 submissions. Because we aligned this with the Environment Southland LTP process, some of those submissions came in via the ES LTP process. And so that what that meant was that we just made sure that we captured those. There were a few late ones that came in associated with the ES LTP process. So hearings were held 16th of May, and one person was held on the 20th of May, but essentially 15 submitters were heard, and there were deliberations that took place over 2 days, the 20th of May and the 20th of June. Just get to the next page, Michaela. So this, essentially the document that's attached in your appendix is the revised version of the strategy. And if you go to the earlier slide, Michaela, with the, that one there. This is really, I guess, a very high level summary of what the key themes were that we worked through in deliberations. And I understand from Councillor Rodway that you're very keen to understand a lot more about the detail of what those submissions were. The full summary of submissions is also attached in the appendix in the agenda. And as part of that summary of submissions, there's also the decisions that got made by the Regional Climate Change Working Group Hearing Panel in regard to each person's submission. So there were quite a few changes that were made to the strategy, but there were also basically a list that started getting collated in terms of some of the key things couldn't be addressed by the strategy or revising the strategy, and instead they'll be held over to be considered as part of the development for a regional framework for action.
Just while you're on that, sorry, Mr. Chairman, on that slide, because we'll probably go on to something else. Was there general acceptance, apart from climate change, whether it's right or wrong, real and unreal, but a general acceptance that working together is a good way to solve the problem, or stop duplication, and duplication says costs to ratepayers? Do people believe that that would lead to a reduced cost by working together?
Yeah, I think that was something that came through, was that there was a group of submissions that were very supportive of what we're trying to achieve, some that were kind of saying it's not necessary. But even amongst those, some of those who weren't as supportive of it, they still agreed that if you're going to do this, collaborating is best for the region and probably best for the ratepayers. So there was, we felt that there was strong support for a continuing collaboration, a collaborative approach.
That's good.
I think that, would you summarise that?
And I guess at this point it might also be a good time to check in whether there are particular aspects of the changes that the Climate Change Subcommittee might be more interesting in understanding a bit more about. So obviously there's a lot of detail in that last report. But if there's anything in particular that you're interested in working through.
You know, just, I think if it's okay with you, people just ask questions as we go along, is that all right? There's so few of us who don't need to go through the...
Okay, thanks, Chairman. Couple of things. There's much more talk about equity, and it's not that I don't understand what equity is in this space, but I'm wondering where that came from and what its implications are, I guess, for this week.
I go first. So it's interesting because throughout the work of the Climate Change Working Group, we had bounced between using language that reflected a fairness strategy as a sort of guiding principle, and sometimes people would say, well, what about equity? And we would sometimes have this debate, are they the same thing, are they different? We'd taken it out of the version that went out for public consultation, and it was during the consultation process that it came from the health community. Largely, they said we would really prefer if you included equity, because we're not seeing it expressed enough in the strategy as it stood. So we put it back in, and everyone was kind of comfortable that we talk about fairness and equity together as two terms that are supportive of each other or have a degree of synergy. And so in terms of your question, what does it mean? It comes, I guess we as a collective felt it spoke to that challenge of we don't want to treat everyone equally. We want to make sure that those who are more vulnerable maybe get more support or are not disadvantaged to a greater degree because of equal treatment. We wanted to see that it was fair outcomes for everyone who's going to be impacted by climate change, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And when you read into the health, what is the name of the word? Te Whare Ora? Their strategy is very strong on equity, so I can see why they would want to emphasise.
When you say it's come from the health sector, I completely understand.
Yeah. Perhaps a couple of other comments on that, just while I'm hogging the floor, is it's interesting that there was a bunch of submissions from individuals who were not supportive of the strategy, and there was a group of submissions from organisations, and the organisation submissions were generally, the pattern was they were supportive of the strategy or collaborating for climate response. So it was quite interesting to reflect on that split of organisational versus individual perspectives, and the organisations, such as including Federated Farmers, Te Whare Ora, TAs, they were supportive of taking that collaborative approach and indeed the precautionary approach. I guess that sense of we're not entirely sure yet how this is all going to play out for everyone, but better safe than sorry, I guess, would be the simple summary of that.
Okay,
Not sure that helps.
Yeah, no, that does. The other question I've got is there was some noted in Appendix 1, some opposition to Southland becoming net zero by 2050. Was that opposition, and I may not have read it carefully enough, to the fact that 2050 was an unachievable date, or was it that they didn't think that net zero was a possibility at all?
The latter.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, people are generally not supportive of investment in something that they saw as being needless.
Right, interesting. Thank you. Thanks, Jim.
And perhaps just to extend on that a little bit, we also, as we went through the deliberation phase, we also were informed by the survey, the community survey that had been completed a few months prior, which suggested, as we were trying to make sense of the submissions we've received, that survey suggested probably we've got about 13% of the population who responded to that survey were kind of in the folk who didn't really see climate change as an issue for us to be concerned with. And so that kind of split of 13% and the others kind of gave us some confidence that what we were seeing, broadly speaking, was a mandate for action for climate change.
Okay. You happy with that, Nicole?
I think they're pretty much, I think, so I'm not quite concentrating
Oh,
on it,
that's
but
all
I
right.
should get moved.
So,
Well, I'll ask you some tricky questions later on.
Just do what I
Get him
do,
to agree to
just throw a
something.
comment out.
so maybe I could speak to one more of the bullet points up there, Mr. Chair, and that was around the framework for action. A lot of some of the feedback we received was talking about things that the group who were considering deliberating felt really good points. We need to carry those forward to the framework for action. And so we've got a list of things that we believe will be appropriate to consider and reflect on how we bring those into play as we do the framework for action work. Noting that it was quite specific in this strategy that this was a two-part effort. That this would create the foundation upon which to build that framework for action. So we know that this was never going to, in and of itself, shine a light on everything that needs to be done in Southland in terms of our climate change response. But it's an important foundation or a step towards that framework for action that will work with us to guide us all the way forward.
I think, Chairman, amendments have given it some more strength and clarity of language particularly. I think it hasn't subverted its general direction
No.
at all, strengthened it probably, and
So, yeah,
does it feel heard as well, so I think it's
and to build on that comment, technically we weren't required to run such an extensive
no.
public consultation process. We chose to do that. And I believe it has strengthened the result. It's probably a more legitimate result that we've gained from that, and one that I'm far more comfortable now to, along with others, to support as we ask each council in turn to endorse this. And essentially, once each council has endorsed it, that will sign off that phase 1 work and allow us to focus entirely on the phase 2 work that's coming. But to me, it was a very thorough process, and the staff, Anchor in particular, was pretty instrumental in imposing that discipline on the process to allow the deliberation to occur. And I would also notice that we did enjoy excellent collaboration from the other councils
Correct.
in that process. So that was really, really good to see how the other councils. Yeah.
Yeah, that was good, Peter.
Yeah, just when we get to first, I understood when we started down this process, the only other regional group was the Hawke's Bay region that had a collaborative. Is there any other regions that have followed Hawke's Bay in the south?
There's been a variety of, Hawke's Bay were never the only one. There's been a variety of various collaborations around the country. Not all have been complete, like in our case with the regional council and all participating territorial authorities, plus Te Ao Marama. So we're pretty lucky down here with that. But yeah, more and more this is seen as a way forward.
And just secondly, when we get to strategy, and I think that's a really good way of looking at it, and then the framework for action, is that going to be like an adaptive type feature as we get new information coming in? It's going to be able to filter down to responses, like sea level is going to rise 2 meters, and then next year they're telling us 2.5. That can filter down through into those action plans. Is that how? I know that sounds quite complicated, but is that how things are wished to be designed?
Yeah. So there's actually 2 parts to that question. I'll perhaps ask the second part first. Is that definitely we need to make sure that this has a degree of agility, so that we can remain adaptive in our approach moving forward. And there's been some excellent presentations we've enjoyed amongst, at least at the staff level, and some of the councils have enjoyed on the dynamic adaptive planning process, which has been used and deployed in other parts of the country to respond to climate-related and sea level-wise challenges, especially in the Hawke's Bay, for example. So yeah, we'll definitely need to have built into it that ability to adapt and adjust and change as new information becomes available. Going back to your first part of the question, the framework for action itself, is one of the challenges that we've seen we've recognised that there is something called a local government election looming in 2025 in about a year's time. So we've got about 12 months left before there will be a natural break and momentum for the council, the governance component of the climate change working group. And what emerges at the other end of that 4-month hiatus is likely to be a new team at the helm. So that focuses us on, we've got to deliver this the framework for action needs to be delivered and agreed upon by all of the councils prior to August next year, this time next year. So that's really brought some real focus to the working group around what is it that we can achieve within 12 months from this point. And therefore, if we don't have all the information in 12 months' time, when we need to lock that in, again, that forces us to remain or design a framework for action that remains adaptive and able to accommodate new and further information. We know that the regional risk hazard thing,
National Climate Change Risk Assessment.
we know that the regional one that we were working on is not going to be available until after that election into the next year in 2026, for example. when we're anticipating that being available. So, you might argue, well, it's foolish to get too far ahead of yourself in planning for adaptation until you've got that hazards information at a regional level. So that's an example of where there will yet be further information to inform our planning, actions and thinking. And the framework for action needs to be able to accommodate that.
Sorry, one kind of weird nitpicky question. When you say precautionary, that raises a little bit of a red flag for me, because does that mean slow? Does that mean slower, or does it just mean more carefully considered, but still not rapid, but continuously useful?
From my perspective, certainly not slow.
Good.
So no, it's kind of saying, it speaks to that idea that we don't have all the answers yet, and we know that it could be worse than imagined, could be better than imagined, but in the absence of certainty, let's play it carefully and accept that some worst case outcomes might emerge, or things might emerge at a faster rate than we expected. We need to be able to respond to it. So better to have the arrangements in place should they be needed, rather than to not have given any thought to the arrangements.
As long as that word precautionary does not slow the work down.
No.
Don't have time.
Right. What's next then?
Would you like to go to the next slide? The previous one, which is the actual document itself, whether there's any interest from the subcommittee on stepping through the actual changes. These are covered off on page 16 of the agenda, which is the appendix to the interagency report. All of them follow on from decisions that were made in response to the submissions.
Sheila, I don't think we need to step through it. It's all well laid out. Yeah.
To make sure that opportunity is there.
Unless Peter, do you want to go through it one by one? No, he
And
doesn't.
alongside this, I guess, just to reiterate Councillor Morrison's point, is that quite a few places in the decisions, the direction was that some of the aspects of the submissions are probably more likely to be suitable for consideration as part of the framework for action, and so that list is an ongoing list that's in development to make sure that we've got that all captured and can be considered as part of those discussions as well. So though, yeah, all of that feedback, basically, not making sure that we don't lose sight of any of it.
Yeah, great.
So next slide. Okay. So yeah, essentially, given that where we're at, we're stepping through now a consideration process by each of the partner agencies. So next week, so we'll go to a council meeting and board for consideration. In the following week, Te Ao Marama will consider it at the board meeting for endorsement, and Invercargill City Council at their council meeting for adoption. And then a little bit later in early October, that's when Southland District Council have scheduled it in for a council meeting for consideration there. So the proposal is that we step through all of those individual agencies and then bring it back to Environment Southland for the final consideration via the strategy and policy meeting on the 16th of October. All of those dates are potentially subject to change, but that's the current and process that's envisaged. And in the meantime, so actually if you skip over to the next slide, Michaela, that shows you that picture of those dates, so just to be clear. Then next slide, Michaela, you've got the other phase is obviously progressing the regional framework for action. So this has been one of the reasons we've had a really quite intense period of work, because we've been running phase 1 and phase 2 in parallel over the past 6 to 8 months. And so phase 2 has progressed somewhat in the meantime as well, in the sense of there were the proposed aspirations and the proposed principles, and they were what the discussions were being considered within as the context. So the workshops, there have already been a series of workshops that have been held, and there are still a series of workshops to go for the rest of the year. And as Councillor Morrison mentioned earlier, that the idea of trying to pull together something high level that illustrates what that might look like going forward, aiming for the next LTP process and beyond, because we are really playing a long game here within the climate change sense. So yeah, that's also probably with the national direction, which is Environment Southland Council have had quite a few conversations about recently too, in terms of the emissions reduction plan. Those sorts of discussions will also need to start falling into place. And then lastly, in terms of that last bullet point, one of the criticisms that came through quite strongly about the strategy process to date, especially the early stages of the strategy process, is that it was quite an insular process. It was very local government focused. While there was a public consultation process aligned with the ESLTP process that was quite formal. But the idea is that once we've definitely got somewhere landed with a strategy, that conversation needs to be extended broader in terms of broader community and industry engagement, and making sure that there's that consideration of what that might look like and what's needed for that framework for action. So last slide on this is really just a touch point in terms of, in the strategy document itself, one of the aspects of the framework for action was the fact that each local government agency wanted to have the space to be able to do their own agency action planning associated with this within their own legislative mandate. And the purple along the bottom is obviously the fact that there's an acknowledgement that there's definitely space for further collaborative projects to eventuate. So on the far left, Environment Southland Action Plan, that's probably really where we're at now, is starting to initiate those early conversations for what does this actually mean for Environment Southland.
On a strategy and policy front, or on the ground?
Probably both. Yeah.
I'm just a bit worried that we haven't got a quorum at the moment, so we better just hold tight until we can get at least one of them back.
Their own weird universe. The power, the man has the power.
Thank you. Right, so is that it then, Anka and Phil?
Could I make one more point? And if you would, Carl, could we go back one slide, just to the previous slide, the bottom bullet point there about, that one. That idea of running a stakeholder hui or community hui, just want to explain that a little. There is a cluster of aspirations around engaging with the community. It's actually part of the strategy is providing for that community engagement. So there's that part of it, plus there's also the criticism we've got that you've developed this first phase 1 strategy without going out and seeking ideas from the community. So we saw that this hui as an option, if we can get off the ground and get support for it and make it happen, some sort of community hui would serve two purposes. One, it starts providing a channel for us to start getting some ideas back from the community on some of our thoughts for the phase 2 framework for action, as well as that first step in the process of building a community of learning and a community of engagement around climate change in the region. There's a sweet spot for us that probably sits in November, and probably in the first half of November, where there's a sweet spot from a regional climate change working group that would allow us to engage with community and take some of the ideas that emerge further forward into our framework for action planning. If we were to defer it until after the new year, there's really starting to cut into our working time to actually work with that feedback from the community. So there is an aspiration, and I'd call it an aspiration, to run that hui sometime in the first half of November, but we acknowledge that we're going to need support from the different councils to do that, and probably ES may be the kind of the lead agency if we were to get that off the ground. Yeah, so that's the justification logic why we think that a hui would be beneficial. And it may be that it's, you shoulder tap certain people in the community to attend, some representation from the rural sector, from some business sector, from not-for-profits, some of the people who submitted to us.
Yeah.
I think it's a really good idea. Earlier you talked about, Phil, about the idea of getting things through in this electoral term, and always concerned about succession with new councils, that a hui could aid in pulling those people together to ensure a bit of succession.
And it's not unprecedented. We started
Yeah.
this conversation with a hui at Transport World. It was probably slightly more targeted in its invite list, but certainly that's not outside the realms of possibility. I would suggest that there might be either different parts to that or different hui, depending on your target audience, right? Just finding how you access, because there's quite a big difference between having, I'd get the high schools in, right? You'd get some students in and you'd have a session, a targeted session with them maybe, or do you have everybody in the room together? So I guess there's some kind of logistical issues there and what you actually want out of it, but absolutely not. I don't think that's impossible. In fact, I think it's essential.
I guess a decision point, Liz, right? So we probably need to make a decision on this by mid-September.
Yeah.
If we're going to do it in November, to one, put in place the logistics for it, and to also get the invites out to secure sufficient participation. So there's, if we don't have it locked in or a green light to go on it by mid-September, then it's probably not going to happen this side of Christmas, and we may have lost that window of opportunity.
Although there might be a series of them, and then maybe you get started in November and have something,
I'm reluctant to channel my inner Shane Jones, but I think we've already made a decision.
Yeah.
So remembering that
Our recommendation to the Strategy and Policy Committee.
we're one council among 5 agencies, so we need to have these kind of conversations with others.
Right, so are we ready to consider the recommendation now? Was there anything more we wanted to say? So we'll go back to the recommendation, which is on number 10. There are 3 points in there. Just recommendation to the
I'm happy to move all three if you like, Chairman.
okay, thanks, Lyndall. Seconder for that, Peter, thank you. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, team.
Right, now the other item is the organisational emissions reduction progress update. Paul, you've had a baseline report done. Your Selman was
Yep.
Right, any comment on this, Hank?
So I've pulled a few slides together for this one as well, but really it's to run through the appendix that's attached in the agenda. So the agenda item is on page 82. If you go to the first slide, Michaela, essentially just this item is a progress update because it's been a wee while since we've had a climate change subcommittee meeting, and there has been a little bit of beavering away in the background. So essentially there's two sort of key chunks here that I'm going to just touch on. The first is you'll be familiar with the fact that the 2022-2023 financial year baseline was established, which was this report here presented to the Climate Change Subcommittee last year. And currently we're working on repeating that inventory for the 23-24 financial year. And alongside that, the previous conversation we had with the Climate Change Subcommittee was around establishing organisational emission reduction pathways. The fact that we developed some guidance to kickstart that. So this was endorsed by the Strategy and Policy Committee in November last year. So the next slide, Michaela. Just as a recap, the baseline inventory indicated that we've just over 2,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. And where we're at for the 23-24 financial year is basically the whole cycle starts again in terms of the inventory. And we're very much at that gathering data stage at the moment. We do have verification booked in again for in a couple of months' time. So that's all on track. The next slide. This is also just a recap in terms of the baseline inventory. This is a good illustration in terms of the split of the key mission contributors for our organisation. And so that's just a bit of the context, but really in terms of the beavering away, really needed to start thinking about how that guidance could start informing a bit of a direction for a way forward for actually reducing emissions. So basically there's a little bit of a tension that we found in terms of developing a thought through strategy and figuring out, making sure that we've got all our ducks lined up in a row, and the need to get on with things in terms of action. So where we've actually landed in a little bit of the meantime, and this is still being in the process of being worked through internally, so this is just at the very draft stage, is the fact that we wanted to conceptualise a way forward that would find a little bit of a balance between the two. So in terms of the strategy aspect of this work, to really embed this within our organisation, it ideally needs to be picked up as part of the organisational strategy review that is work in progress. So the starting point for this is an interim approach. If you go to the next slide, Michaela, is the current where we're at with the strategy, which is, you'll be all familiar with our mission, our vision and our values, and essentially just establishing that our goal that was set for becoming a net zero organisation by 2050, that was set in March last year, is consistent with the current mission, vision and values. So that's, a very simple starting point. If you go to the next slide, Michaela, it was about trying to assemble all the puzzle pieces. And so the next chunk of the puzzle pieces were the fact that, yes, we've got the 2017, there was a local government leaders climate change declaration that highlighted Environment Southland's commitment to this work. There's also the what was proposed regional climate change strategy aspirations. These are now revised regional climate change strategy aspirations, but that's the regional context that gives weight to this work. And then in terms of our organisational goals, the fact that we've agreed to become a net zero organisation by 2050. And the last key bullet point there was the direction from council to set achievable and sensible interim targets towards that 2050 target.
Have we defined what those sensible interim targets?
Yes, so I'm coming to that. No is the answer, but I'm coming to that. So the next page, and as we keep building on the puzzle pieces, obviously the baseline inventory is a key part of the puzzle piece, and that's summarised there. And in the next page, Michaela, is the fact
2,000 tonnes isn't an overly bad figure.
It's not a no, and if you
I don't think.
It could be a lot worse.
And the next step from that is, once we've assembled all of those puzzle pieces, is really about the fact that acknowledging that we need to develop some sort of reduction plan around that. So on the next page is the fact that we wanted to define some key terms around that, and I just want to note that that diagram there is modified from the Toitū diagram in terms of acknowledging the source, but making sure that we're talking about all the same things is really important. And then what that led to is, next slide, Michaela, determining some next steps. So where we got to in terms of finding that balance between developing strategy versus getting things moving is making sure that we've got 3 streams of work covered, and that we'll get to a place of using those streams of work to be the foundation for making sure we are sure about those sensible and achievable targets as part of the 2027-37 LTP cycle, or earlier, because it could always happen earlier depending on how things go. So, yeah, in a nutshell, decided that the targets couldn't be magicked up. So if you go to the next slide, Michaela, the 3 key streams of work is really the fact that we need to have the organisational inventory work covered off and stepping that through. There's work that's already underway for this financial year. There's work that we need to make sure happens for the next financial year in terms of trying to bring that in-house. At the moment, it's still Salmon and Associates that's doing that work for us. But for that to become BAU, it really needs to be coming in-house. And then hopefully by 26, 27, we've got that a really good handle on that, and that'll be business as usual. And as part of that process, it's about embedding that within our organisation. The second part of that is the evaluation of options. So when we were talking about what sensible and achievable organisational interim reduction targets might be, we really decided that it needed to be, we needed to have some sort of indication as to what sensible might look like, what achievable might look like, and how we were going to evaluate that. So setting up, based on the guidance, pilot projects, for example, learning projects, trial projects, to make sure that there's an element of organisational learning that takes place to enable that evaluation to happen. So that evaluation of options, which would then feed into a ongoing longer-term emissions reduction pathway. And then the last stream in the green below, organisational emission reductions pathways. This is where learnings from, there's a staff interagency working group that has close connection with our TA partners, specifically on the subject. And what has been interesting is learning a little bit more from where the other agencies are at. For example, the City Council are a bit further ahead than us. The District Council are about on the same path, but as we're working through ideas, one of the things that has stood out is that procurement is a really good place to start, and also things like reviewing policies and things to bring those documents in line to start that emissions reduction journey. So making sure that those basics are a starting point for that. So all of these, I guess, different streams need to start happening parallel to each other this year, moving on to next year, and then hopefully eventually getting to a place where that'll inform emissions reduction targets that are sensible and achievable going forward. If you go to the next page, when we were talking about setting interim targets, we looked at 3 different options just briefly, and I don't really want to go too much into the detail of this, but it's something that I'd be quite keen to come back to if the Climate Change Subcommittee is interested in. But essentially the first one there, setting targets based on the average reduction required. It's kind of a simplistic approach where you draw a line between now and 2050, what's the average reduction required, and it comes out at around about 75, 76 tonne per year. Very simplistic, but nothing to indicate whether that's sensible or achievable. So then the second point there, science-based targets, particularly for categories 1 and 2. This is the direction that globally seems to be getting more and more traction. And this is about setting targets that are in line with the Paris Agreement goals of 1.5 degree reduction. And so they are seen as a lot more robust going down this track. And if we were to seek advice from a consultant, for example, Toitū, then it would be the case that we might have a grace year or so, but within the next year or so, we would be needing to go down that track to be on board with them of considering science-based targets. And then the third one is the Council's direction, which is sensible and achievable interim targets. And to that point, it was just that the key thing we felt was that we needed to undertake a little bit more learning and evaluating to understand what that could look like for our organisation. We were too late for this LTP process, so that it makes sense to allow this to be a period of time to make sure that that's in place for the next LTP process. This slide here, just to highlight, this is an extract from another region's plan. But it's basically, the key thing to highlight there is about getting some target clarity as well as allocation of responsibility, and how going down this track will hopefully help embed this within our whole organisation. It's going to need to change various aspects of the way we do our work. So in the last slide, Michaela, is just a summary really, summing this up, that as an interim way forward, seeking to enact the agreed guidance that was established with and endorsed by the Strategy and Policy Committee last year, making sure that we're resourcing this interim approach accordingly, so that essentially we're going to carry that organisational learning out, and we'll be in a place of establishing those sensible and achievable targets by the next LTP cycle. So in the meantime, I expect this is still being worked through internally. So in the meantime, I expect that this is something that will remain fluid until we work through probably the more developed strategy stage or the more developed action stage. But this is kind of what's holding things together in the meantime. Do you want to add anything more to that?
Actually, I wonder, I've got Amy down the back, who has obviously a lot of oversight in her role across the business in this space, and whether you wanted to add anything, Amy?
Yeah, look, I'm really happy to do so, and thank you for the opportunity to do that. I just want to acknowledge the work that UNCA's been doing in this space. There's a real tension here, as UNCA has pointed to, between getting on with the job and making sure that you've got the information and the resource, whether that's people or funding, to be able to do the work. Acknowledging that when you're in a learning situation, everything takes so much longer. We want to make sure that if we're directing effort and energy towards the pursuit of targets, that those are actually going to make a material difference, or the effort to outcome ratio is going to be proportionate. And I think the other thing that I'd reflect when we started these conversations a couple of years ago, when we first got our first measurement back, it's easy to look at things like fleet and go, it should all be electric and all the rest of it. But even in the example that you see here from one of the other councils, you're still relying on the technology to be available in New Zealand for it to be affordable in order to be able to adopt a meaningful target. And so, again, acknowledging the need to get on with it, but also not set ourselves up to fail, and to make sure that we're appropriately focused and resourced to do this work, and having this opportunity to consolidate these new approaches into the organisation through this LTP, so we can really, we'll be in a much more different situation next to the LTP in terms of being able to take an informed approach and really getting into the meat of it. That's the plan.
Thanks, Amy. Yes, it's not really straightforward. It requires a fair bit of consideration, Peter.
Yeah, I think it's really good. It's a huge amount of work. Are we quite puritanical in the way we're approaching this? Is just reductions? Do we, when I see just over 2,000 tonnes, I see that as not even 70 hectares of trees. Morris will know that. Are we, so people think offset is a dirty word. That's terrible, because offset means that you don't reduce. No, it doesn't mean that. Offset means that it gives you a room to put store some stuff away, store some emissions away while you reduce, and then you reduce your offsets. It's a mechanism to help you achieve the interim targets. Now, I would say that, just without me knowing anything, but a lot of these councils are just throwing figures out in the air and saying this will keep people happy for a while, with no real achievable way of doing it, because all businesses are run on fossil fuels. We know if you take them away, everything falls to pieces. So do we have to consider what options we have in regards to offsets that can guide us through this interim period? And I'm just putting that out there. I'm talking about a reality of achieving that interim target. And I think you're absolutely right, Amy, when you said we've actually got to do this and show a pathway really clearly. Yep. We don't want to be like all them others that just, not that they'll keep people happy.
No, and look, it's I think the conversation's nuanced, because in one way, if you're offsetting, then someone else has got to go and do the mahi in order to be able to,
Well, procurement is an example of that. We're pushing liability onto our contractors. That's an easy way out, I can see, for other councils.
Yeah, I think there's a broader way to look at that as well, and the question that comes down to is, what does it mean to be a leader in this space as well? acknowledging that it is a new space. And I think, some of the principles that we've got, I think fair to say, to your point, nothing's off the table, but let's get the information. The principles that we've got, look to reduce fees prior to offsetting. And I think, there probably are opportunities across the board where we can.
I'm saying when we get to that big vision of that big huge chunk sitting in front of us and we go, oh my God, we've done all this, but this is still there.
Yep. Oh, acknowledged. Yep.
And the opportunity to be a leader, totally,
Mm.
I think that's a great comment. We should be doing that. And that might be looking at that big chunk and saying, we're going to attack this a different way in a responsible fashion.
Yeah. And, the other thing that we need to remember, and, we're having this conversation, I think, about other areas of work that we're doing. And this is not about kicking the can down the road, but we've got, there are 25 more years to 2050. There will be advances in technology in that time and approaches. People will be maturing what they are doing. We don't need to solve it all today. In fact, in terms of crystal ball gazing, that might be nigh or well impossible. But there's opportunities, I think, to look sensibly forwards and to get some meaningful targets and look at all the options on the table in terms of achieving those.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, we're never going to get to net zero without some offsetting.
Mm-hmm.
It's not possible to do that. If you plant a tree today, a pine tree today, it's not until 10 or 12 years down the track that it's storing, 25 tonnes a hectare of carbon. So even that is going to take some time. I know we've got leaning on our lands. We're sort of talking about this a bit. If you rely on native trees like we're doing at the block at Waituna, that's a tenth. It's much, much slower in terms of storing carbon. It will accumulate it for a long period of time after, 50 years and that sort of thing, but that's an even longer time, and we won't be able to do that by 2050. It's just the trees just don't grow fast enough. But we can have a combination of those things. We can have some pine trees and then, the native trees on the Webster block, and in 30 years' time we'll take over. Those are the sorts of things I think that we do need to be seriously looking at.
And to your point, Chair, I just think it's really important to acknowledge that there's a tension between all the things that we want to do. So if we want to plant trees here in this piece of land, then we can't use it for something else. There's the cost from a resource and a financial point of view about where we want to invest our effort and energy. We are balancing these things all the time across this portfolio of work and our other portfolios of work, and taking some sort of systems approach to all of that is going to be important going forwards, because this is not a thing that we're doing over here in isolation from the other work that we're doing as well. So there will be conversations to be had, indeed.
But still, we still have to realise what we're proposing. We're proposing of extinguishing the use of the master resource, they call it, out of our business. The thing that holds everything together is given, it's not to be taken lightly in thinking that, hey, we're just going to do this without any type of sacrifice. And there'll be quite a bit. So, yeah.
Peter, yes, we've got Phil and Lyndall.
I had a few thoughts, and maybe I'm thinking out loud as much as asking questions, but to that point, I guess one of the things, Peter, that emerges for me is that to acknowledge we're not on this journey alone. We're not doing this in isolation. Every other bugger around the country, around the world, is also at the same time trying to work out the same thing. So we're kind of going on a journey alongside others. It seems to me that there's quite an emphasis here on making sure we do our homework before we start to settle on what are the appropriate targets and even the form of those targets. I guess I was wondering, as I consider the different emissions contributions in our baseline, if that actually suggests that maybe those three different methodologies for setting targets, that actually you might match a methodology to a particular emission type potentially. It might be that you could set an average reduction required for a particular emission type, like employee commuting. And you maybe then you use a science-based target for embodied emissions on capital construction materials, for example. Maybe there's an opportunity to consider, explore whether there is a more than one approach that could be brought together in a system that allowed you to. But I do acknowledge that learning by doing is also important. And so getting on with some actions and understanding, so how does it feel to make emissions reductions? What can we learn from that is important. And I just note that it's great to be working alongside our other TA partners in Southland. I know that there are others nearby who have got very ambitious emissions reduction targets. So Queenstown District with their zero carbon tourism experience 2030, for example. It'd be interesting to monitor and watch what are they doing, what levers are they pulling, how's that working for them, and what can we copy and paste from their approach potentially.
Thanks, Phil.
Final question, what are you most excited about, Anchor, as you've been doing this? Is there anything that jumps out at you that gives you a greater sense of hope and optimism than any other aspect of it, or is it all entirely depressing and despondency causing?
So I guess it has taken a little bit longer than anticipated to progress even to this stage. But it is still a little bit of progress. And so if we were to fully resource this, then I think taking up on that opportunity in terms of shared learning in terms of the organisational learning, I think that's a really key point. We're not the only organisation that's figuring this out. And businesses and industry, have quite a few much further ahead. So I think there's a huge opportunity there for making sure that we keep picking each other's brains on this and doing this together.
Oh, so many thoughts. Just on what you've just said, Anka, about fully resourcing, asking what you exactly mean by that. Do you mean a position, or do you mean 2 positions, or what do you mean?
I'm happy to take that. It's really easy to sit and think that the organisation can just go and get on with this. But the reality is it needs someone who has capacity, and I'm not saying it's another person, but it's someone who's got capacity to champion this within the organisation. So they need some knowledge, they need to be working with the various parts in the organisation. If we take the trial example, to be able to walk alongside these teams, because they don't know how to do this, what to be thinking about, how to be capturing it. That takes time, effort and energy. And at the moment, it's predominantly Anka who's sitting, holding all of this with Neil. Like, for example, we needed to use an external resource to actually do our measurement, because getting over that and understanding what's required in a humongous level of detail, we didn't have anybody to be able to do. Now, he's been able to, it's like the icebreaker and the ice, I guess, for us on that, and that knowledge is being handed over into the organisation. But driving this new way of thinking, being the champion for the learning, pulling people together, walking alongside them to support and help embed the learning, that takes time, effort, and energy.
I don't see it as, in fact, vastly different from having, a risk specialist in the building, right? But, we need a climate change specialist, changing climate, specialist.
We don't really have specialists, and that's why I think you're doing an awesome job.
Yeah, so she's turning into a specialist.
You are actually a specialist, because I can imagine sometimes you think, oh my God, who will I call? Oh, that's right, no one else knows anything more than I do.
Yeah,
So I really celebrate
and
that,
specialist,
the work
perhaps the
that
wrong
you're doing.
word, but focused, I guess, is and learning along the way, because it's all new territory, as you say. A couple of other thoughts. So that fully resourced conversation, and you've talked about LTP several times, but actually we've got annual plans along the way. So we need to make sure that we have some markers for annual plan. If we have to go out and consult on this one, then we go and consult on a substantial change to whatever. We've got annual plan for the next couple of years. And these are just kind of random thoughts. So apologies if I'm insulting your intelligence by stating the obvious. But there are not a golden thread, we'll have to call it a green thread today, right through so much of the organisation, and the accommodation conversation that we had earlier today. You know, these are potential for a huge reduction in some things. Should it be a purpose designed building that was sustainable building and covered off all of that stuff. So there's that layer. There's the scope 3 and scope 2 accounting for our procurement and our contractors. There's the leading on our land part of the conversation. So that thread, very difficult to master plan that, but it's everywhere. So we've got opportunities. The other things, just very quickly, transition and that offsetting space kind of speaks to the equity conversation as well, because actually that transitional solutions that we can find will make it more equitable, I think, for some who may not immediately be able to make it financial investments per se or whatever. And the other thing is you talk about science-based targets. Given that every time we talk about science from outside this building, somebody debates the science and questions the models, I'm a little bit, it makes me a wee bit nervous, because the naysayers all, and not just the naysayers, the well-informed, all groups actually question our science all the time. So there's a conversation to be had around, and especially because it's new science, most of it, and actually quite hard to give it the mana that it deserves. I think that's all my random thoughts. Thank you, Jim.
Well, thank you.
Just to add or extend, one of those thoughts was around that in the strategy we identified, yes, there is adaptation and there is mitigation. But within that, there's actually some overlap. There's going to be some sweet spots somewhere in that mix. And there's going to be stuff that we can do that reflects a move that captures both an adaptation advantage as well as a mitigation advantage. And so looking for those sweet spots within all this, I think that's going to be kind of cool. And, a combination could be one of those, one representative of one of those sweet spots moving forward. And that kind of thing, I imagine, it's not going to be a straight line improvement. It's going to be sort of a punctuated equilibrium where there's a sudden step up and gains, and then it may level out, and then another step up and gains later on.
I'd like to think that we could capture some of our thoughts and thinking at this early stage, and probably in years to come revisit the way we thought about it and what we're going to think about it when new information, new modelling comes in the future, and say, wow, actually we were thinking down here, but we should have been thinking up here. So, some of those examples would be quite good to look back on this.
Being recorded.
Come back to haunt you.
Through you, Chair, I just want to pick up on the comments made about the building, and of course there's an enormous opportunity, whatever we do, to end up with a building that's way more fit for purpose, and from a climate point of view, but also acknowledging the process of building a building.
Yes.
Will be heavily resource intensive and no doubt have a negative impact on our current emissions. Ditto any current large infrastructure works that we are doing, and we just need to be cognizant of that. We're working with existing technologies. Some of our providers and those larger players in the market have got, they're wrapping their heads around this, and again, it goes back to the conversation about being able to use the procurement for this, but then coming back also to our role of leaders. What's our role in the space to support perhaps some of the smaller local outfits that we use to support them with their learning as we evolve together or grow together. in our understanding of what this is. And
I'll just say in regards to building materials, Douglas fir is an excellent timber. We always have discussions about those trees, don't we?
Right, well, thank you very much. I must confess, and I have talked to you before about this, Anka, and I've talked to Stephen Kenny about it, who was at our last regional meeting. And that is, relates to our operating boundary. And I see the definition here says includes direct and indirect emissions that are organised, that the organisation controls or influences. And I'm thinking, just to make everybody aware that I think this is an issue, because we have our lease lands that we're not including at the moment, and we have Southport that we're not including at the moment. Stephen, when I was talking to him about that, I'm sure he said he thought that based on criteria that other people use, we should be including Southport because we are the owners of it. And because we are owners of our lease land, we should be including. Now, I don't think he agreed with that, but I'm thinking that, it's hard for me to know why we should leave those out. I know Southport will have their own program, but as majority shareholders, it seems to me that we should be trying to at least talking to them about reducing theirs because of our connection to them, and also to the leaseholders about the way they operate their business. So I know that's a bit peripheral, but and I don't want us to include things that other people are not including. It seems to me that there's a bit of a grey area there that we need to be clear that we are either in or out, and there are very good reasons for that.
If we go back to the baseline report that Salmon Associates drafted, I've got it in front of me, but I can also recirculate it if that would be helpful.
Yeah.
But in that report, it clarifies the two key ways that you can determine your organisational boundary. So control, which is the organisation accounts for 100% of the GHG emissions and removals, over which it has financial or operational control. And the organisation can choose between financial or operational control, or equity share. The organisation accounts for its portion of GHG emissions and removal from respective operations that it has a share of ownership. So we've gone with this is a conversation that we had with our partner agencies in particular to make sure that we've got some alignment with our partner agencies. But basically where we got to for the baseline report was that the application of operational control made the most sense, which in this case is where Southport is clearly outside of the boundary on that basis. And also, in a sense, the leasehold land as well, though that is something that could be looked at over time, given that there's contract arrangements in place. So that's as part of the cycle of going around and validating organisational boundary and then gathering data and things. That's something that Salmon and Associates has recently revisited, and following up on the conversation that was had at the Regional Climate Change Working Group, I did check in with them again to just make sure that we could reconfirm that point. So we're going to continue at this stage with calculating the GHG inventory in the same manner as we did with the baseline inventory, and this was verified by Tortu. The baseline inventory was verified by Tortu, and that was something that they were happy with.
Thank you. Peter?
Yeah, I just think that's an interesting set of questions there, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, carry on with what you're doing. But I'm just saying, maybe for us to think, and you've mentioned lease land, of using it some sort of offsetting way. I don't think it's, from my view, that's a council discussion. We administer the land. We don't own it, as far as I'm concerned. If we want to use that land, we have to take the liability off it too. I think you can't have one with the other just going in and saying that we're going to take this block of trees here and this and that native area there, and we're going to use that for our accounting purposes. I think you have to take that liability with those landowners too. So it's all or nothing as far as I'm concerned, but it's an interesting concept to have a think about anyway for the future.
On the sort of the concept that you can't really manage what you can't measure. While we've clearly stated it's outside of the organisational boundary at the moment, if there was ever any measurement of that, then you could what would be the management options associated with that. But it would at this stage be a separate thing, a separate project. Perhaps as part of the
Do
leading
we
on
put a
things.
management, if we get to that point, you could put a management thing over the top of that land and say that we'll take the liability, but we want ever responsible for the management of that too. I don't know. Just put it out there.
In the meantime, I still think there's a lot to get on with
Yes.
and
Yeah.
within the organisational boundaries. So I think that needs to be with the priorities, very least in the short term.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Right, are we ready to adopt the resolve to receive the report?
Yes,
Linda, would you like to move that?
I would.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
And second, Phil? Return. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
That's carried. Thank you, and thank you, Annika. And then we go on to item 10, which is extraordinary and urgent business. I don't know of any. We don't have any public excluded business, so I'll declare the meeting closed and thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
It surprises me how much